Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully the topic that we're going to cover in this webinar today is highly relevant, given combines are already starting to roll. So it really is a kind of very relevant time to be talking about how we can complete end of season reviews and grain analysis. So the webinar today is a webinar that we're hosting for the NUTRI-CHECK project, and it's a great opportunity for us to talk about how we can look to optimise crop nutrition. If you can move to the next slide, Tamara. So before we get into the technical detail, I just want to give an overview of some of the housekeeping points. So the webinar is being recorded today, so if you need to leave at any point, you will be sent a link to the webinar afterwards that you can watch back, and we'll also share this widely as well. So during the webinar, attendees are muted and your cameras are all switched off. If you have a question that you want to ask and you want to actually ask that, there will be an opportunity to unmute and ask questions. But perhaps the most efficient way to ask your questions is to put them into the chat. And any questions that you have for Tamara, who's going to give the technical presentation, we will address straight after her presentation, or feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And then during the discussion with Michael and Jackie, again, please put any questions that you've got in the chat or raise your hand. We've got basis and Neroso points available for the webinar today. So Laurie has just shared a link to a form, which is a place where you can share your basis and Neroso points with us, and we'll make sure that they get assigned to you. If we can move to the next slide. So just to give a brief overview of our agenda today. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of plan, check and adjust and review, and discuss this as an approach for how we manage crop nutrition. And then Tamara's going to give an overview of some of the work that we've been doing at ADAS, looking at grain analysis and the value of measuring grain analysis. So she's going to talk about nutrient balances, offtakes, and how we can use grain analysis to understand deficiencies, and also talk about the value of benchmarking. I'm then just going to give a bit of an overview of some of the key actions for this season, and thinking very much about what farmers should consider doing right now as harvest approaches. And then we'll move on to have a Q&A session, and we're really pleased to be joined by Michael Brewis, who farms in the Scottish Borders. And Michael's been involved in one of our crop nutrition clubs, which we have run as part of the NUTRI-CHECK project. And Jackie, his agronomist, has joined us, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how they work together from the perspective of understanding data and using that information to inform decisions. If you move on, please, Tamara. So before we go into the detail, I'll just give an update on the plan, check and adjust and review approach. So I've talked a little bit and mentioned the NUTRI-CHECK project. So this is a Europe-wide project which ADAS are leading. And through the work that we've done in this project, we've come to recognise the urgency required in providing better support to farmers and advisors to enable them to optimise crop nutrition decisions that they make. And to help facilitate this, we've developed a framework called the three-step checking approach. And this focuses on three key elements, which are planning, making checks and adjustments, and also a step of review. And whilst farmers are generally good at considering the nutrient requirements of a crop by creating a plan, they rarely check and adjust that initial plan. And only very recently have we discovered that harvest analysis can reveal how well plans and adjustments have worked. On most farms, the success of nutrient applications and the decisions which guide those applications is determined by yield, irrespective of the fact that many non-nutritional factors affect yield. And we know that nutrient concentrations of harvested produce show whether the crop has captured insufficient, adequate, or excess amounts of each nutrient. And they enable farmers and advisors to really get to grips with and review nutritional performance, soil nutrient balances, and efficiencies of nutrient applications. And this is really important in terms of informing future nutrient management on a crop by crop and a field by field basis. So in the webinar today, we're going to focus on this third step, review, where we're going to explore how an end of season review is a vital step in order to learn from the season and provide a number of actions or amendments to strategies which can feed into the following season's planning. So we really see this as a continuous cycle of moving from a plan to check and adjust to review, and for that feeding into future planning. And later in the season, we will hold a final webinar, which will focus on the planning steps. So look out for further information after harvest on this. If we can move to the next slide, please, Tamara. And I just want to put this into some context. So obviously, for many years, we've largely relied on using soil analysis, and this being done every 3 to 5 years to measure P, K, and magnesium levels in the soil, and also measure pH. And we can add to that soil analysis data set with leaf analysis. So leaf analysis might be used on farm to make in-season checks, to, if there are any symptoms or uncertainties, to use that as a way to help gauge what's going on. But routine annual field by field postmortems are new, and we think that they can contribute significantly to helping to provide better monitoring to improve crop nutrition. If we can move on, Tamara. And before I hand over to Tamara, I just want to raise that in the project, we've collated an inventory of many different tools, analyses, and services that can support farmers with their decision making around crop nutrition. And these tools are now all collated and available through a custom built platform that we've created for the project. So if you go online and Google the NUTRI-CHECK platform, you'll be able to find that. And it gives a bit of inspiration in terms of the number of tools that are available and the ways in which those tools support the different steps of the 3-step checking approach that I've just talked through. So on that note, I'll hand over to Tamara. So Tamara is a crop physiologist at ADAS, so we both work in the same team. And she's going to really give an overview of some of the work that we've done to provide an evidence base for the value of reviewing and grain analysis. So I'll hand over to you now, Tamara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's right. So I'm Tamara, and we're going to be focusing today on reviewing. So I'll be going straight into it. So when we think about reviewing, we could make a checklist of things that we need to look at. We want to look at progress in season as well as what has happened at harvest, so that we can look and review the whole season as opposed to just sort of a snapshot of it. Once the harvest has commenced, it's very important to check your results because they might be very different from what they expected. I have a feeling that this year, no one really was expecting it to be this dry. So that might make a massive difference to what you expected versus what's actually happening. So once you know whether or not there is a difference, it's important to try and work out why there is a difference and see if you can mitigate this next time. Obviously, in the case of the weather, that's not possible, but there might be other reasons why things haven't quite panned out as you hoped. So an important part is our soil stores. We need to know what was already there in the soil. In general, we do our field analysis every 3 to 5 years, where we get all our soil indices, and we can help. We can use those values to help plan for the nutrition in the coming season. The other thing we need to look at is what are we going to add. So we need to know about our fertilizers and organic materials. We want to know what sort of yield we normally get, because it gives quite a good idea about what a certain field is capable of. So we look at past results as well. We look at weather patterns. Again, this can be very, the weather is unpredictable. So it's very hard to determine at the start of a season what is going to happen with the weather, but there is a general weather pattern that we can go off. So we should at least have a look at it and take it into account as much as we can. And then in season, we could do a plant tissue nutrient analysis, where we take leaf samples and we send them off, and we get the nutrient composition of the leaf samples that we've sent. And this will give us an idea about how much the plant has already taken up from those soil stores. And it will also give us an idea whether the plant is on track, because we know what growth stage we've taken the samples, and that means we know roughly what we're expecting the nutrient concentrations to be. And if these are not adequate, then we might be able to adjust for that and sort of help the plants out a bit to get to the end in a better state. And then at the end of the season, we should do it would be good to do a grain nutrient analysis so that we can see what has actually happened. We know what we put in, we know what was already there, but we hardly look at what we're taking off. So by doing a grain nutrient analysis, we get a good idea about what we're taking off. And because this is an evidence-based approach, it is quite a strong value, a strong measure to use in your decision making later on for the next season. So when we look at measurements for management in crop nutrition, we have a lot of different parts. So we generally know our inputs, which is our fertilizer. We know our soil stores over here. What we don't know, though, so we know our inputs, our soil stores, we know them roughly every 3 to 5 years. We're not entirely sure what is in the crop, because it is not something that's routinely measured. And what we definitely don't know, because we don't really measure it, is how much is being lost to the water, how much of the nutrients, how much is being lost to the air through volatilization, and what exactly our outputs are. So going forward, if we want to get a more accurate idea about what is happening in our field in terms of nutrition, we want to focus on those bits that we can work out. So losses to the air and losses to the water will be very hard to determine. You'd have to have special measuring equipment to get exact numbers, which, we don't have on farm. But what we can measure is the outputs, and it would just be very good to routinely do this to get an idea about what is going on in your field and how the outputs are changing depending on your field and depending on your different inputs. So when we looked at a lot of the yen data as well, and we've been measuring the outputs, and what we saw there was that there was definitely a value into measuring the nutrient harvests in helping making decisions for planning the next year. So we do think it can be an economic benefit to do this. So then we can calculate everything, and we know what we have because our inputs minus the outputs, and then plus or minus the storage, depending on whether there's a deficiency or an excess, will give us exactly what's there. So this can greatly help us sort out our planning for the next season. So when we look at it, you might think, well, RB209 has got all these values in it already. And I'm going to say, yes, they do. But there are a few hiccups with that sort of data. It's really good that RB209 makes a mention of several of the grain nutrients. So it mentions nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. However, it's not quite as straightforward as it might be. So what you can see here is a distribution of the grain nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium over, so it's the percentage in the dry matter. So let's just use nitrogen as an example. So we've got the number of fields here on the y-axis, the percentage of grain nitrogen on the x-axis. And you can see there is quite a nice normal distribution of this. So there's several, well, there's quite a lot of fields that have about 2 to 2.1. And there's not very many fields who have a grain nitrogen of 1.5, and the same goes for a grain nitrogen of 2.7, 2.8. But when we look at the values that the RB209 gives, it gives all these standard assumptions. So it makes the assumption that your nitrogen offtake is sort of here. And the same for the phosphorus, it's roughly here. And for the potassium, it's claiming it's here. And what we can see is for the nitrogen, it's fairly in the middle. It's fairly on the average sort of numbers that we see there. So this is where our data peaks based on 1,700 different crops, different wheat crops. So you could say that's quite a good measurement, although within your field, your specific field, you might be on this end or you might be on that end, and then it does change your future. It could change your future decisions on nutrition. When we then look at phosphorus and potassium, we see that in general, the standard UK assumptions that are there for soil maintenance are slight overestimations of what we actually see in field. So again, it peaks here. So the grain phosphorus in a percentage of dry matter is most common at 0.3, but RB209 assumes a higher value for that. And the same for potassium, where the most common values are roughly here, around 250 fields that have a grain potassium of about 0.45, whereas RB209 assumes much higher content of 0.55, which is a big difference. So we can't always rely on just the standard numbers, because in reality, our fields aren't like that. Our fields aren't all neatly covering this line. We have lots of different fields and they all form these different curves, and your field might just not fall on that line. So it's important to measure your own field to know what's going on your farm, as opposed to just having these average numbers. What is good about the average numbers is that we can use them to compare our fields with a lot of the other fields, which is a good thing to do. So it's just that just relying on the averages in the RB209 might not be the best for your particular farm. So when we've got all these values, we can look at the nitrogen response, because nitrogen is quite, it responds quite neatly. So it makes a really lovely curve here. So what we can see here is we can see the amount of nitrogen is applied. So this line here is the optimum amount of nitrogen. applied to a winter wheat crop. So this is data from 46 winter wheat trials. And if we go to the right of that line, we apply over the optimum nitrogen rate. And if we go on the left side of that, we under apply nitrogen compared to the optimum. And what it shows here is the effect on grain yield. So what you can see is your optimum grain yield is here, where the lines sort of cross. And that means that's the economic optimum, because you could say, well, actually the yield here is higher. It is, but the amount of nitrogen added there was more expensive than the yield benefit you get from it. So it's not economically beneficial to add this. And then you can see that there's quite a steep drop off here, which means that if you don't apply enough nitrogen, there's quite a high yield penalty, which results in quite strong economic losses. So getting your nutrition right is really important. We can estimate how many pounds a hectare are lost from non-optimal nitrogen use. So we can very clearly see what's going on and what could have been done and how much is lost. So this can really help us tailor our nitrogen fertilizer demand, and it can help us make decisions on how to get the most out of our fertilizer, because that stuff is quite expensive, as you all know. So we want to use it to the best as we can. So this is the winter wheat trials. We can see a similar graph for barley trials. Again, we've got the optimum, the economic optimum here for nitrogen. If you go below it, there's a steep drop off. If you go over it, again, there is a bit of a penalty for having to apply the nitrogen that's not actually going to give you much of an economic benefit. For oats, we see a very similar graph. It's just more sharp. So it's more of a sharper curve. That's characteristic for oats. But the same counts. So again, we've got our optimum here. If you go down, you steeply decline and you get lots of economic losses. And if you go over it, in the case of oats, you get quite strong losses as well, because there's not a lot of benefit in adding more nitrogen when it doesn't need it. So when we're looking at this, it's really important to realize that we can estimate this yield, this loss of income based on non-optimal nitrogen use. So it's important to look at what we're doing and to optimize that as much as possible. So when we're looking at this graph, this shows the grain nitrogen content, and it's based on about 100 RL trials that have received nitrogen as is recommended in the RB209. So the RL percentage of proteins that you can see in this dotted orange line here gives a really good measure of each variety's norm. So we've got the grain yield here in the yellow line, showing here, and you can see here on the y-axis, the main y-axis, it's the grain yield in tons per hectare. We've got the difference from the optimum nitrogen applied. So again, the optimum is here in the middle where that blue line is, and we're going to the left and we're going beneath optimum, so suboptimum. And on the right, we're going above optimum, which is again something we don't want to do because we don't want to spend a lot of money on fertilizers when it doesn't really give us a lot of yield benefit. Then we've got the grain protein here on the right side, which is, like I said, indicated in these dotted lines. So what we want to do is we want to get a good grain protein, and we also want to get a good grain yield. And when you look at the RL trials, you can see that this is sort of the normal distribution that all those varieties have. So if you want to look at the variety you've got and you want to see where it's at compared to the norm, then you can compare it to the RL trials, which gives you a very good indication whether you're above or below the sort of norm for that variety. So it's good to go back, and once you've had your yield, once it's all measured and weighed, to go back to these graphs and to these numbers and be, well, I had this variety and this is what the RL trials show the normal yield would be based on RB209 recommendations. This is what I got. Is there a difference? Have I got more? Have I got less? And then you can look at, well, what could have caused that difference. If you've got more, great. If you've got a lower yield and potentially lower grain protein, then you could think, well, what was different this year? What could I have done differently? What could have happened, really? It's good to then go back and think about what's happened throughout the season and work from there. So what we aim to achieve is the RL protein norm, because that is what gives us the economic optimum. So when we look at this, this is the economic optimum where we've got our bullseye. That's what we're aiming for, where we have a loss of £0, which is ideal. So this graph's looking at feed wheat. And then again, if you defer your protein, so if you go less protein content, a lower protein content, you get losses on this side. And if you have a higher protein content, you have economic losses, which are shown on this side. So as you can see, a drop of 1% might not have a massive economic impact, say £25 a hectare, but as soon as you drop 2% in your protein below the economic optimum, that causes £100 a hectare loss. So it adds up quite rapidly. So getting your nutrition right is really important to make sure we don't end up here. And we don't want to end up here either, because we don't want to over-fertilize, because it's just a waste and it's not necessary. So when you look at the RB209, it's got a lot of information on what is happening. So it mentions that if your protein is 1.5% lower than the optimum, then you can incur losses of about £50 in unrealized profit. So in an 11-hectare field, you would miss out on £550 of profit, which is quite a decent amount, and it could have been prevented by applying adequate nitrogen. So it's very important to think about all these factors. So when we then go back to the story about grain analysis, how does grain analysis come into this? Because it's nice for me to say, well, you need to get it right. Obviously, we all want to get it right, but how do we get it right? Well, to be really honest, it's really tricky. So what we're doing is we look at a balance and we look at our maintenance. So we know what we applied. So in this example, we're looking at, say, nitrogen. We know they applied 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. We know what the crop captured if we measure it, and then we can calculate how much is lost from that. And we know what the actual offtake is, which means that there is a residue if this is not the same as what the crop has is supposed to have captured. Looking at it from this way, we can actually see what has gone on in the season, and we can use this information, because if there's a residue, then we could use that residue for next season. So it's good to look at those things. So another thing that we can do with grain analysis is we can diagnose deficiencies and excesses. So what we have been doing a lot is making these little graphs called box plots, where you can look at all the values that people have entered. So in this year, there were 211 wheat fields that had been entered into this this sort of benchmarking exercise. And you can see the lowest value was just above 1.5. The highest value was just about, I would say, 2.9% nitrogen. And this is the value of this particular field that we have taken as an example. And this is the critical threshold. So that means that this value shows that this wheat field was really doing well. It had a good amount. It was well in the efficient, sorry, in the sufficient area. So this can then take us back to like, okay, right, I did something right that year. So next year I can do something similar, or base my, I can carry on doing it as I am. Whereas if you were in this area here, you might want to consider, actually, I need to change something. So if we carry on with that, let's focus on that first aim, where we want to balance our inputs and our harvests. To diagnose potential nutrient deficiencies, we want to record any nutrients we've bought and how much we've applied to each field. That also includes organic manures, which we won't always buy them, because we might just have them on farm. So we just want to know what we've applied. then we need to record the nutrient harvest from each field, which is the yield times the percentage of nutrient. So to do this, we need to know what our grain analysis shows. So this is why we do a grain analysis. And that will give us a very good indication of what's going on. So we can then do a field nutrient account where we have an expected yield. We've got an actual yield here, which in this case was higher, but based on the expected yield, we decided to apply these values. Or well, this is what we should be applying to make this yield happen. Then we know what the soil analysis is because we've done our soil analysis. So we can then adjust for that here. So this is what we should be applying. And this is first organic fertilizers. In this case, no organic manures were applied. So we then add fertilizers and sprays, and we've added whatever we needed that wasn't in the soil. And then we look at what the crop has captured. So what we do here is these are the standard offtake values that we can calculate. We can look at several things. So once we've done our soil analysis, we can fill that in. Once we've done a leaf analysis, if we do that in the middle of the season, we can fill that in and we can make adjustments based on that. So these are the values that you might see from a leaf analysis. Then we can do a grain analysis, where we look again at all the different values along here. And that means we know how much is taken off. So based on the grain analysis and our yield, we can calculate how much was taken off. So we fill that in here, and then we can calculate how much is left in the soil. So in this case, we've taken more out of the soil than was in there. So we've got a deficiency. And in the case of sulfur, we have taken less out of the soil than was there. So for next season, you might not have to apply sulfur here, whereas you definitely want to apply potassium, and most likely you want to apply nitrogen, unless you maybe grow a pea crop or something like that. So it's important to look at all these values. I know that looking at it like this can be quite daunting, but it's good to keep an eye on what is going on in your field, what have you done, and how can you adjust. And based on this, we know that we can make these adjustments for next season. So we know that actually, even though the recommendations say we should apply sulfur, for example, we might not need to, because we know that it's still in the soil without having to do an extra measurement of the soil. So then if we go back to our little graph about balances and maintenance. So we've looked at our balances and maintenance. We did our nutrient account, and then we can look at diagnosing the efficiencies and deficiencies and excesses. So what's important to keep in mind is that grain nutrient concentrations diagnose the final crop performance. So it doesn't give you any information for in the middle. If you want to know anything about what's going on mid-season, you'd have to do a leaf analysis. But we know that there is a lot of difference in distribution between the grain and the straw. So phosphorus is mainly accumulating in the grain, whereas if you look at potassium down here, it's mainly accumulating in the straw, as you can see in this sort of light green section. And this is similar for a lot of the different crops. So we can see this in wheat, barley, oats, so all the cereals, but we can also see similar things in oil seeds. We know that in oil seeds, sulfur is not very, doesn't accumulate very much in the grain at all, compared to in the cereals. And then we have similar values for field beans and peas. So this will help you look at things from a perspective of, well, what have I got in my yield part of the crop, and what have I got left from the rest of the plant. And it will help us if we decide to leave our straw. If we incorporate our straw, then we can see that, you know, if we leave our straw on the field, we obviously leave a lot of potassium on the field, so we might not have to add that for next season. So this will really help us to get a better understanding of where these nutrients are going and what is potentially being left behind in the field. So we have done a lot of measuring during our time with the N. We have looked at a lot of wheat and a lot of other crops, but wheat is the one that comes back a lot of the times. And what we found is actually there is a lot of deficiencies. So what you can see here is out of the 2013 to 2020 data set of wheat fields, we found that there is a lot of deficiencies. So nitrogen is commonly deficient at over 20% of fields. Phosphorus is over 60% of fields showed phosphorus deficiency. I'll make a note as well saying that these are not showing all the 12 nutrients, the sort of major nutrients and micronutrients. That's because these values are known to have a critical value, and the other values there's no literature that has a proper critical value. So we've stuck to those values here. Because there's literature stating that, yes, a crop is deficient below a certain value, which is what these all fall into. So we see there's a lot of deficiencies. And then when we look at this pie chart here, we can see that out of all those fields, 24% of them had one deficiency. And you think, well, that's pretty good. But then actually, 28% of all those fields had two deficiencies. And then when we look at it, over here, there were 3 or more deficiencies in over 30% of the crops, and there was only 14% of the fields that had no deficiencies at all. And that's it's a relatively small percentage. So having a deficiency is very common, and it highlights the need for knowing what's going on in your field. If you do this grain analysis, you will know whether you are in this 86%, in this 76% area, or whether you are in this 14% area where you have no deficiencies, or you might have a or more deficiencies. So it again highlights the importance of looking at what your crop has actually done, and not just being like, right, we've finished the season, we've got our yield, and let's move on and carry on again next year. It's good to step back, see what's happened, do that reviewing, and work from there.
Tamara, just a few minutes left, okay?
Okay, thank you. Yep. So when we look at the benchmarking, we are trying to understand what the performance in the field is. We are trying to learn from the fields by using big data sets. And important for this is that we share our data. And when we do that, we can make these benchmark diagrams, as I've shown before, where you've got a potential critical value that you know. You have your data set with all the values, your middle 50% here, and your value that's there, and you can compare against other values. And by doing this for multiple fields and multiple nutrients, you can learn things about your farm. So in this case, I've just highlighted a few things that if you look at sulfur, it is relatively low in multiple fields, which could indicate a farm-wide sulfur deficiency. So this is something you might want to look at. But then if you look at field number 3, for example, it's got quite a few low values, which could mean that something in this field is causing a reduction in nutrient uptake, which could be bad rooting, for example, or there could have been like waterlogging on that field that caused some issues or things like that. So by looking at the overall picture, we can pinpoint where there might be issues, and we can try and determine where these issues are, like a sort of a detective. We can work it out. So in terms of practical advice, what I'd like to bring forward is that it's important to check your yields, compare your yields to what you expected them to be. What are they really, and why are they different if they are different, and see if there's any quality factors there that might have affected this. So in the case of that overview graph I just shown, there was low sulfur. So for next season, you might want to apply more sulfur. So these are things you want to look at. We found that there's sufficient phosphorus in most fields. So then it's a matter of maintaining the levels that are there. So field number 3 looked low on several nutrients. So we want to check whether there's disease, whether there's drainage issues, whether there's rooting issues and things like that. And it's important to compare with previous years, because if a certain field has always been doing worse than the rest of your farm, then, you know, there could be something in that field, but that could also just be where that field is. If it's just in an area that's prone to waterlogging, there's not too much you can do about it. potentially, and you just need to accept that that field is not going to yield as high as you might want it to. So a summary of what I've been talking about shows that grain analysis enables crop nutrition management. So the nutrients are invisible, we can't see them. Often when we do see a deficiency, it's already gone quite, it's already too late, really. So we want to manage our crop by measuring our crop on a field-by-field basis. To progress, we need to understand the field variation and we need to achieve better control. And what we've seen from the yen is that the standard nutrient offtake values are exaggerated. There's a big variation in crop nutrient concentrations, and this is almost as big as the yield variation. And most crops do have nutrition issues. There was only 14% who didn't. And the variations quite often farm related. And when we then think about it, what can we do? What can we take home from this is that there's a big opportunity for us to understand how and why the crop nutrition varies. And we can do this by sharing our data and analysing the data field by field. So the labs can analyse this, but they do need the extra agronomy data if we want to do any benchmarking. But if you can do that, then this can really develop a more certain understanding of the farm by farm and potentially set new standards for our nutrition decisions. So yeah, that's what I'd like to talk about. So I think we can have a moment here for some questions, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll pass on to Sarah first.
Yeah, there's one question I'll ask and then we'll move on tomorrow. So Stephen Tompkins has asked about whether historic satellite imagery, so for example using NDVI, could have a role to play in understanding field variability and perhaps linking that to which areas may offtake less nutrients than others.
Yes, so I think that's very good. That's very good. Yes, this can help, because if we look at multiple years of NDVI imagery, we can see if there's certain areas that are consistently high or consistently low. If you've got yield mapping on your combine, for example, then you could potentially link that to your yield map as well. So if you've got multiple yield maps of the same season, sorry, not of the same season, of different seasons, then you can compare those and see if there are high or low yielding areas. So looking at NDVI of your field over multiple years, it's important to look over multiple years, but yes, that will definitely help with getting a better understanding of where there might be issues in your field or where their variation is. So I definitely do recommend having a bit of a look online. You can find the NDVI data online. So
yeah, I think it's kind of putting together different data layers and trying to really understand what's going on using the information that you've got available to you, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll just make a few comments now with the slides I've got, and then we'll move on to Michael and Jackie. So could you just move on to the next slide, Tamara, please? Yeah, so I just want to highlight a few things in terms of, you know, if you're a farmer listening to this, what should you consider doing as harvest kind of comes up? So it's obviously been a tricky season, but the main thing to say is that there's still value from measuring. So don't be put off, because Tamara's already mentioned the dry conditions, which have obviously been challenging. If grain analysis is something you're considering, it's really important to get organised quickly. Decide which lab you want to use and try and stick with the same one. So from year to year, if this is something that you're going to be using, try and work with the same lab. Ideally, order sampling kits before harvest and make a plan of what you want to sample. And another really important piece of advice is communicate with your team. So make sure that for example, the people that are carting corn know that you're wanting to do this so they can be involved in sampling, because making the right kind of sampling procedure is going to contribute significantly to the accuracy of your information at the end. If we move on to Mara. So I've just put up here a few examples of different kind of ways in which you can go about doing grain analysis. So you can see here a couple of example reports from the labs where they give some interpretation and guidance with the results. So you can see here NRM's grain check and the report from Landcrop showing kind of a different kind of traffic light system to try and highlight where there may be concerns and maybe where some of these nutrients were sufficient. And then Tamara's talked about the value of benchmarking. So through ADAS's NUTRI-CHECK service, that provides additional insight through reporting on offtakes, but also some of the figures that Tamara's presented earlier show those benchmarking charts that we provide back as well. If you can move on. And there's lots of guidance available to support sampling for grain analysis. So this just talks through, it seems obvious, but at the time when people are in a rush, it's very easy to not necessarily do things correctly, and it kind of impacts the accuracy of the results that you get out at the end. So, you know, having good labels so you know what samples came from which field, making sure that you're sampling each load as it comes back from the grain store, and then take a subsample ready to send off to the lab. So it's just making sure that you use good principles for sampling to get the best results. And I think, yes, so I've just added on here a couple of examples of some of the reports from Yen Nutrition. So looking at offtakes and also these target charts that we provide to help indicate whether farms have got their nutrition kind of in line with others this season, or maybe there are some outliers that need particular focus. If we move on, please. And then I also wanted to highlight that there are tools that can support nutrient balances and calculating offtakes. So the Planet software allows you to do, it's more of a farm gate level than a per field level, but allow you to calculate nutrient balances. And NRM have a handy tool that allows you to calculate offtakes as well using nutrient concentrations. Okay. Yeah, so I won't talk through those points because we're short on time, but yeah, making sure you get organised is really important. So I'd now like to ask Michael and Jackie to turn their cameras on. And just thank you both so much for joining us this morning. I think we've given a kind of technical oversight of why doing grain analysis and measuring is important, but you've obviously got the kind of actual on-farm experience of using this. So Michael, maybe if I can just ask you to kind of briefly introduce yourself and the farm and where you're based, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. Morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Michael Bruce. I farm mixed farm along with my dad, 3 other members of the team working on the farm. We're 430 hectares, 300 cereals, the rest made up of kind of rotational and permanent grass, grazing crops, fodder beet. We've got 150 Angus cows, 600 sheep, and other things. We've got a biomass boiler, 120 kilowatts of solar. We've been using soil, leaf and grain analysis for a few years now. Jackie's a main part of driving that. She's got an N tester and we've got an N sensor on the roof of our sprayer. So we're doing kind of what we can to analyze and check and adjust as the season goes on. And that's basically us.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And Jackie, do you want to just give a bit of an overview of yourself and kind of where you're based and maybe some of the farms that you're advising on?
Yes, I'm based in Northumberland and the Borders. I'm an independent agronomist, been working for myself now for over 10 years, can't remember how long it is. Been an independent agronomist for too long that I can remember. And working with mixed farms, some mixed farms like Michael and Ewan's, some all cereals. That's about it, really. A group of the Magic Circle is a lot of independent agronomists that meet for technical briefings and trials and things like that.
I mean, Michael, obviously, the NUTRI-CHECK project is all about trying to optimize nutrient management. From your perspective, you know, you've talked about doing soil analysis, leaf analysis, and grain analysis. What's driving you to want to optimize what you're doing?
Well, I think naturally we all want to try and improve, but the real instigator of it was COVID, and the nitrogen prices probably is most people's most recent driver or instigator to try and make these changes. And when you make these changes, you need to kind of know whether they've been good or bad. Quite often, as you spoke in the earlier parts, that these factors can be things that aren't your control. So you have to be quite careful about what you do with the results. And I think the important thing is building up data over time and not having knee-jerk reactions to, you know, one bad answer to your testing. So that was kind of where we started. And we started trying lower nitrogen levels, and we went a little bit too far, but we worked that out in the aftermath of it all. But you don't know where the limits are until you find them. So that's what we did. But the testing thing is essential to know what you're doing and whether it's been successful or not. The easiest ones I would say are probably the soil sampling, because personal effort is very, very low. You just employ someone to do it. And the grain samples, again, if, like you were saying, if you're organized, you have a system in place pre-harvest, you don't combine straight through the plot and combine the cane like I did at least once. Planning is the key, and as you said, you make everyone on the team aware, because quite often I can be concentrating on something else and the trailer driver says, oh, you're meant to be getting a sample here. So letting everyone on the team know that that's what the plan is, getting everyone on the same page is the most important thing when it comes to taking samples.
And Jackie, I'm really interested how you and Michael work together, because, I've got to know Michael through the NUTRI-CHECK project, and it's very clear it's a partnership between yourselves. I mean, can you just kind of talk through, how you work together to look at the results from the information that you're gathering, and maybe, is this partnership, is this replicated with the other businesses that you work with, or is Michael kind of really keen on the data and measurements, and you have people that are less so, perhaps?
I would say Michael and his family are very keen on looking at the data. They always have been very proactive in this kind of thing. I mean, I'm using the end tester every week. I'm there every week. So I'm doing the end tester every week from sort of growth stage 30. When we're doing leaf analysis, we're trying to do it so that we know sort of T1 what we need. We're matching, if we have trace element deficiency, we're trying to match products that'll help that and alleviate that. We're then going back leaf testing again to see whether we've managed to do that. So we're checking again on that, and then doing the grain analysis. It doesn't always come out how you expect. We seem to have cracked the oilseed rape somehow. We're getting greens all the time with the oilseed rape, but we're having a little bit more difficulty with the cereals, and that sometimes the leaf analysis is coming back fine, and then the grain analysis is coming back with deficiencies. So it's looking sort of closer at that. So then leaf analysis saying, yeah, we've managed to get everything, going right, and then the grain analysis doesn't. We're looking at putting the same amount of sulfur actually on the wheat at the minute, and we're getting deficiency with the grain analysis, whereas we're not with the oilseed rape. So the grain analysis, as I say, we're doing up through all the crops. So it's winter wheat, winter barley, the spring barley, and the oilseed rape.
And I suppose, I mean, Michael, can you kind of give some comments about when you get the results, and obviously you and Jackie are working together to try and understand what's going on, how are you using those results? And I mean, from what you've said so far, it's obvious that it's you using the soil analysis, the leaf analysis, and the grain analysis as part of that end of season review. How does that then feed into what you do next season? Does it inspire you to do a trial or to test things, or does it inspire you to make a kind of broader change because you've got a number of years of data that you can pick up on?
Yeah, so post-COVID and the fertilizer price going up, that was when we really kind of started to try and change things. So there was, obviously, we tried to use less nitrogen and more biologicals. We were hoping that we might have to use less fungicide due to the lower nitrogen use. So that was really where it all started. And then at the end of the season, we kind of all sit down, we look at the results, we kind of make a plan of how we're going forward. And then the people that actually generate our variable rate maps also use that information to then feed into what our plan is going to be going forward. And we're probably up around about the 190 kilos of nitrogen mark on our wheats. We did try down at kind of 155, 160 for a couple of years, but we didn't see any. We were trying to measure it all based on margin rather than yield. So we're taking into account of the lower nitrogen costs, the biologicals, and the non-fungicide based products that we used actually were about as much as the fungicide. So although we had a bit of saving in nitrogen, we didn't have an awful lot of saving elsewhere, and we did take a hit in our yield. And going back to the nitrogen curve, that's where you saw that if you take 50 kilos off, you really fall off that cliff, and we fell pretty hard. So we've learned, and we know that with our current system and the way we're doing it, that we can't go that low. So yeah, that was kind of the process through that, and that was, we did kind of 2 tram lines in too many fields, to be honest. It all got quite confusing. But the general consensus was that in most crops we had gone too low, and the margins also didn't work out. I mean, we were quite happy to take a hit on yield if we were still going to maintain a margin. I think there would be a place for lower inputs. If you're growing less crops, you're going to go through with combine quicker and use less diesel. So that was where we kind of thought we could farm for margin rather than yield, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, earlier we had a question from Jim about how does the optimum rate for nitrogen relate to nitrogen use efficiency, and we know from the work we've done that you won't necessarily get the greatest nitrogen use efficiency at the optimum nitrogen rate. Often, actually, the highest nitrogen use efficiency is when you apply no fertilizer at all. So it's interesting that I suppose it becomes, what's the ultimate target here? I mean, is nitrogen use efficiency something that you're kind of actively considering, or you've talked about yield, you've talked about margin? What's kind of the measure for you in terms of success?
Well, certainly the nitrogen use efficiency was what we were trying to aim at when we dropped our nitrogen levels. We were hoping that with the biologicals and with less fungicide use, we could maybe increase the nitrogen use efficiency and still get, near to the yield that we were before, but with lower inputs. But yeah, that wasn't the case. I mean, it was 2 to 3 quite exceptional years for wet back ends, dry springs. I don't think anyone was setting any records in the last few years, which is why we go back to these things. You have to spend years doing them. You can't just take 1 year's data and call it gospel. It's in fact, that would be at your peril, I would say. You're better to do nothing than to try and do that.
Jackie, Ian's asked about the form of sulfur that's being used. So you talked about the challenges of seeing kind of sulfur deficiency in some of the results. So have you looked at different sulfur products, and has that had any impact on the results, or is this something you might kind of follow up on?
Yeah, the whichever form of sulfur we're using is the same for the rape and the wheat. Generally now we're going down the route of using, we can use liquid and solid. We go down the route now of 19N, 19SO3, putting 80 kilos of N on early onto everything to see that. And then throughout the season, we're using the 35N7S. So we're putting on a fair whack of sulfur. Sometimes if the liquid is a little bit too expensive, then we'll use something like a 2637 solid. But that just depends, you know, on the price of fertilizer. Yep. But obviously using the liquid is preferential to get it into the plant quickly, especially on a season like this season where it has been so dry.
We are at 9:30, but I'm afraid I'm enjoying this discussion far too much. So I'm going to carry on for another 5 minutes. So I hope people listening will have an extra 5 minutes to spare. So, Michael, there's a question about just asking about, do you grow milling wheats or is it feed wheats that you grow?
It's all feed wheat. So we're going for yields. Yeah, that's how we do it. We've got all storage, all drying on site, so we can dry and store, and we can keep it as long as we possibly can. So that's how we do it.
I mean, I think it's a good point, isn't it? That there's value in measuring protein, even if you're not growing milling wheat. So still Correct. Understanding, and Tamara obviously talked about, we looked at those curves, and I mean, the analysis that you've done, obviously there will have been seasonal impacts within that, but have you kind of consistently seen that you're getting grain nitrogens or protein levels around the right mark? Or have you actually seen that, you know, when you talked about reducing fertilizer rates, presumably in those situations, the kind of proteins did drop significantly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, again, with it just being feed, it wasn't a big issue, but we did notice these things. So it was quite nice to see, even though the results weren't positive results, but it was nice to see the response, to know that, you know, what we're doing is wrong, so change it. I think the leaf analysis is probably the one that can be, probably your best to go on. Your N tester for your green area, and your soil analysis is I think is a hard and fast fact, and your grain analysis is a hard and fast fact. The leaf analysis, I think, can vary depending on the leaf you take, depending on the process, depending on the time to the lab, depending on, you know, there's more variables, I think, whereas the soil analysis is a hard and fast snapshot, and I think the grain analysis is obviously a good indicator of exactly what is in the grain.
I mean, Jackie, from your kind of experience as an advisor, I mean, are there kind of elements of using grain analysis that you're more confident in? So maybe for some nutrients you're confident and you have uncertainties for other nutrients, or what are the challenges to using it from your perspective?
The challenges, I think, are sitting and working out why in the end, when you sort of, you know, you've gone through the season and you seem to be doing okay, you're using the N tester, you're using the N sensor, you're going for absolute N, and you're getting a low nitrogen in your grain analysis. So it's all sitting down, discussing what we're going to do to try and rectify that. We have in the past as well used point sources in fields where we've gone to the same place every year in fields to try and get it so that we're getting a perspective on the analysis of that area to see as well. So it's one of these things that, you know, it's as clear as mud at times, but you need that analysis to rectify and try and increase your margin and increase your yields, which is normally what happens. If your yields, then your margin increases, which is what we're looking to do.
And we've talked about obviously bringing together data from multiple sources and through the season. I mean, Michael, can you comment on how are you managing data on your farm? And is it an opportunity data, or is it a bit of a challenge still in terms of you could do more?
Yeah, definitely. I would say both of that. You know, there is very much a challenge. You know, the data comes in so many forms from different companies. And, you know, do you keep that as a paper copy? Is it kept on the computer? I think there would be an opportunity for a platform somewhere that could integrate everything together. You've got your Gatekeeper and your Omnia, but I don't quite know. I don't have the answer to this. You know, it's very much the case when we discuss these things. It's very easy to isolate what the problem is, but getting the correct answer is the very difficult thing. And the last thing I want anyone to do is to go and do all this sampling and then it just sit in a folder on the office shelf. And I'm sure that does happen all over the place. But using the data is really important. But it does take time, and you have to set time aside to do it, which as a farm is quite difficult because it doesn't seem like the most important job right now. Quite a lot of the office jobs do kind of get put to the bottom of the pile because of that. But again, if you want to move forward, if you want to analyze changes that you've made, you're going to have to analyze data. Unfortunately, it's not a very fun job. It's not the most exciting if you're into practical farming, but I think it's very important to do.
I'm just going to ask for one last comment from you both. I mean, if we've got farmers, advisors listening, kind of, if you could kind of give one piece of advice for what to do, kind of, we've been talking about grain analysis, we've been talking about making a review, kind of what would your advice be to somebody listening that's just about to kind of start harvest? What should they do? Jackie, if you've got a comment.
Well, if they're just starting harvest, then I think it's worth them trying the grain analysis to see where they are on that spectrum. Every season, to be fair, is different with the leaf analysis, depending whether it's wet, dry. But it's a good idea. You go to the doctor, he gives you tablets. You know, you need to go to your crops, see where their deficiencies are, and look to give them the best like trace elements and nutrients that you can to get the optimum out of them.
Thank you. Michael, comment from you?
Yeah, I don't fancy going and taking leaves and putting them in the post and then waiting weeks for an answer. I don't think that's much like productive progressive farming. But the grain analysis and the soil analysis are definitely something that I would recommend to people to do if you're interested in knowing what your crop's doing. There's things in that you will never see with your eyes, but at the same time, don't discount your eyes. You know, use your eyes, see what the crop needs, and generally go on your gut, because you know, if you're the farmer, you've probably got years and years of experience, and you can't build up years and years of pictures of data without doing those years of testing. So you either need to commit to it and do it, or probably not commit to it at all.
Great, thank you. And thank you to those of you that have stayed on, because that discussion was really interesting. And I'm sure it's valuable for people to hear kind of first-hand insights and you know, those real experiences. So thank you so much for that.
No problem.
So just a reminder, if you haven't submitted basis and Neroso points, please do that using the form that has been sent in the chat. As I said, the recording will be available afterwards. And yeah, I'd just like to thank Michael, Jackie and Tamara for their contributions, and wish everyone a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.